Hello there. Thanks very much for joining me. This is part 2 of a series of webinars on future strategies for Ovine Johnes disease. The objective of this series is to equip sheep producers in Queensland to effectively manage Johnes disease risk into the future as the program for Johnes disease management in this state and nationally changes. The first part of this series reviewed the basics of Johnes disease as we know it in Australia and Queensland. Following this, there'll be some more details about a new JD strategy for Queensland. The purpose of this webinar is to explain the changing frameworks as in Queensland at the moment. These changes are positive changes designed to reduce the regulatory burden on producers and enable producers to better manage Johnes disease risk for their own advantage than what is available at this point in time. In 2013, the National Johnes Disease Program for Sheep, that's Ovine Johnes Disease, OJD, was revised. In effect, the national program supported a deregulatory approach, and that program was implemented nationwide. However, in low prevalence areas of Australia, primarily Queensland, South Australia, areas of northern and western New South Wales and a small area in northwestern Victoria, those areas determined that they wanted to maintain protection against the introduction of Johnes disease and established regional biosecurity plans. In Queensland and South Australia, those regional biosecurity plans essentially continued the regulatory protection of the former program. In 2015, the National BJD program, that's Bovine Johnes disease in cattle, underwent a review and established a new framework also. And that has gone down the same path as the OJD review in 2013. It no longer supports zoning or recognises low risk and regulatory control of Johnes disease nationally. The Johnes disease program for cattle from the 1st of July will rely on market-driven management by producers at the individual property level. There's still going to be notifiability retained in order to facilitate export certification, but responsibility for managing Johnes disease will lie with the individual producers. That's pretty much the same as the national program for Johnes disease in sheep, the OJD program. In addition, in Queensland, there will be a new piece of legislation, the Biosecurity Act, again commencing on the 1st of July 2016. This legislation has been supported by both major parties. It's an important shift in regulation. It modernises the legislative framework around Johnes disease. The previous legislation is more than 100 years old and well in need of changing. It integrates a whole lot of legislation around managing biosecurity risks, not only for animals but for plants, pest animals and weeds. And it introduces new concepts around people who deal with biosecurity and animals and plants taking responsibility for the risks that dealing entails. It acknowledges that decisions need to be made based on risk rather than being risk averse, but it also recognises that decisions sometimes need to be made when not all the information is available, and so there's some uncertainty around decisions but using a risk-based approach, those decisions can be justified. One of the core provisions of the new legislation is the idea of general biosecurity obligation, which applies to all people who are dealing with animals or plants in a way which may entail a biosecurity risk. I'll talk more about that in a jiffy. There are other tools in the Biosecurity Act, though, that have a more regulatory approach, such as control and prevention programs, surveillance programs, zoning, orders, or restricted places. The general biosecurity obligation, which is a key feature of the new legislation, requires that all persons who deal with biosecurity matter or carriers, and in this case we're talking about sheep, which may be exposed to Johnes disease risk, must take all reasonable and practical measures to prevent or minimise that risk. So this is about putting into context the context of Johnes disease and the national programs for managing risk and identifying that producers have obligations to manage Johnes disease risk appropriately. Part 3 of this series will examine just how producers can go about meeting that biosecurity obligation to their own advantage. There's further information on Johnes disease available at these websites. Thanks very much for listening.